Howdy, everybody. Yeah, let's talk about how you can structure a story effectively for use in Toastmasters. Now, since we developed language, perhaps even before that, we have been telling stories. They're in our DNA. It's a powerful way to stay connected to the people we know and those we remember. But in business, we use stories to engage, teach, and persuade people. They let us reach our listener on a visceral level before we bring out the facts and statistics that close the deal. Now, all stories are not created equal, though. Very often, the stories I hear at Toastmasters meetings Grandpa Simpson. Like the time I caught this, what they called Shelbyville in those days, so I tied an onion to my belt, which was the style at the time. Now, to take the ferry cost a nickel, and in those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 bees for a quarter, you'd say. Now, where were, oh yes, the important thing was I had an onion on my belt, which was the style at the time. Now, we've all heard rambling tales like this with many, many details, but no clear direction. As we craft our stories, we need to choose details that serve a purpose in the overall narrative. We don't want to introduce random but seemingly significant details that don't lead directly to the denouement. Otherwise, we'll lose the audience, and they might not find their way to the end. This principle is known as Chekhov's gun. Anton Chekhov essentially said that if a gun is hanging on the wall in Act 1, Scene 1, it must be fired by Act 2, Scene 3. Otherwise, don't have a gun hanging on the wall. So how then do you structure your story? Well, you start with exposition. Introduce the protagonist and the current state of the world. At some point early in the story, there's an inciting incident that creates conflict and spurs the protagonist into action. The action rises as obstacles appear and they're overcome. And then there's one final defining moment, the climax of the story, followed by the denouement, where all of the obstacles are resolved. Very quickly, the story resolves. We get a description of the changes in our character. We leave their world to go on without them. Obstacles are very important because when there are no obstacles, the story's over. If you're not ready to end the story, you need to add more obstacles. So to begin your story, choose your protagonist. What do they want? And what will prevent them from getting it? How will they overcome those obstacles to achieve their goal? So you had Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. He wants to leave home for adventure, but his uncle won't allow it. Tess in Working Girl wants to be a financial professional, but men won't take her seriously. And Ralphie in Christmas Story wants a BB gun, but of course, he'll shoot his eye out. So here's actually a more realistic depiction of the action in a story. First, you get to know the protagonist and their world a bit, and then something happens. Tension builds as the protagonist goes from crisis to crisis, finding ways to overcome those obstacles until the climax, the ultimate crisis, is overcome. The story then quickly comes to a satisfying end. But the plot is only half of what is happening in a good story. The other half is the character arc. That's the growth of a character from a place of emotional instability and flaws, their internal conflict, to a place of confidence and acceptance, transformation of those flaws. Though the actions of the plot and consequences on the character, the external conflict, the character's beliefs are tested and he or she learns new truths and experiences, they change for an emotional and satisfying ending. So think of the movie City Slickers. We see Billy Crystal's character grow from a depressed salesman to a heroic cowboy. Now, there are many characters in the film and lots of exciting events, but it's his character arc that's the crux of the story. So it's the flaws that make a character real and relatable. We can identify with their flaws. In a memorable story, the character's flaw prevents them from reaching their goal. Over the course of the story, the character experiences growth and even transformation. Harry Potter starts out meek and powerless, clueless about his impact on others, and so curious it continually leads him into trouble. but he takes responsibility for his power and ultimately realizes that he needs his friends to overcome the evil powers that are trying to thwart him. Now, stories often take the protagonist on what's known as the hero's journey, as defined by Joseph Campbell. This goes back to ancient myths, but we have seen it recently in the Star Wars saga. Luke Skywalker has a humdrum, bucolic life until he receives Leia's message via R2-D2. Obi-Wan invites him to go on a quest. He refuses, but then his uncle and aunt are killed. So Luke leaves his home on Tatooine, facing dangers to rescue Leia. When Obi-Wan is killed, Luke's at his lowest point. But he successfully retrieved the schematics of the Death Star to reveal its weaknesses. Luke blows up the Death Star. There's a celebration. Everybody gets medals, and that's the end. The hero's journey is a time-honored formula used for the most satisfying sagas of all time. So here's how the story progression breaks down. The first quarter of a story introduces the characters and describes the world they occupy. The longer the story, the more we're going to want to know about where the characters come from. In The Lord of the Rings, we spend a good deal of time at Bilbo Baggins' birthday party, the Prancing Pony, and Rivendell, before the Fellowship of the Ring ever comes together to march toward Mordor. The next part of the story wanders a bit. It involves some false starts and red herrings. If it's a detective story, the detective follows some leads that he does. In the Rings, a group, and right there is where the protagonist takes a turn in the right direction. If you watch an episode of House, everything is dire before the 30-minute commercial break, but when we come back, we see the first clue for diagnosing the actual illness, right there in the middle. So the last quarter of the story increases speed and tension as the hero approaches the climax. There should be no break in the action, no getting some sleep, no release until the story is resolved. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones loads the Ark on a pirate ship and takes a nap. Next, the ship is boarded by Nazis, and from that moment, all the way to the end of the film, there's no drop in action until the opening of the Ark itself. Finally, you need a satisfying conclusion, even if it's not the end of the story. In a trilogy, the first story ends with a complete resolution. Now, that's because the writer usually doesn't know whether they'll get to publish a sequel. When they sell the trilogy, the second book inevitably ends in an unsatisfying way because the author knows it's only the gateway to the big payoff they get at the end of the third installment. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but the film version of Return of the King had 7 endings because they had to give a satisfying conclusion for all of the characters we'd come to know and love. But every story doesn't have to be so epic. A great book I read recently is Stories That Stick. The book is focused on storytelling for business. It's a great approach to the sort of brief stories we can add to our Toastmasters speeches. Kindra Hall's straightforward formula for creating a story is to start by describing the normal state of things, which leads to an inciting event that shakes up the world and is followed by a description of the new normal. She then applies this technique to telling 4 types of stories useful in business. Value stories are about the personal or company values. Founder stories are about the beginnings of a company or project. Purpose stories are about the alignment and inspiration of the company. And customer stories demonstrate company values from a consumer's point of view. If you want to add stories to your professional toolbox, I highly recommend Stories That Stick. Well, let's take a moment to talk about writer's block. Now, personally, I know it's a myth. If you think you're experiencing writer's block, there's a surefire cure. Just start moving your fingers over the keyboard or your pen over the page. You might write, "I have no idea where I'm going with this." If your hand is moving, your brain can't stay stuck. it will take you someplace interesting. Now, we create with our right brain, but we edit with our left brain. If we try to edit while we're creating, we shut down the creativity. So let the story flow with that creativity and just write what occurs to you. Later, you can go back and edit the story to make it more concise and compelling. This way, you're engaging both sides of your brain. But mostly, discipline is what's vitally important. Stephen Pressfield, in The War of Art, tells us that the cure for writer's block is discipline. Have a regular time to work in a regular place. Sit down to do the work every day. So this is true of writing your Toastmasters speeches as well. Somerset Maugham said, "I write only when inspiration strikes. Fortunately, it strikes every morning at 9 o'clock sharp." I'm a professional writer, and I agree. I don't have the luxury of waiting for inspiration. I just have to do the work. Now, there's another book I want to bring up. Now, to be blunt, I'm not a fan of a lot of the storytelling I see in Toastmasters. The stories tend to be overly didactic, overly dramatic, and overly dramatized. Outside of Toastmasters, storytelling tends to focus on true personal content delivered with sincerity. If you're interested in working on a more open and emotionally available style, I strongly recommend the book Storyworthy. Matthew Dix is a 36-time winner of Moth Story Slams. His book breaks down how to find your own personal stories, how to craft them, and how to deliver them in a sincere and engaging way. Now, I'm not going to try and replicate the book here, but I'll offer a couple of interesting suggestions. An important element of engaging stories is communicating what's at stake for the protagonist of the stories. Matthew Dix has several suggestions for adding stakes to your story. Every story needs an elephant, the big idea, that's the obvious point. This is what's going to grab the attention and make people want to listen. You add stakes to the story by packing the story with details. Now, not Grandpa Simpson details. Add details that help the listener picture the scene, describe what the character smells, what the character feels in the environment. Help your audience to join in an immersive experience. Breadcrumbs hint at what's going to happen. You want to give people a sense of what might happen without allowing them to actually guess the outcome. And when you have the audience's attention, you can slow down the story as you approach the big moment. Add extra detail. Set the scene as clearly as you can. This builds anticipation and makes people lean in further. Tell your story in present tense. It lets you speculate as to what might happen at the end, and your audience can speculate too. Then you all experience the denouement together. Now, humor doesn't raise the stakes of a story, but it's a helpful way to keep the audience engaged. Remember that the goal of the story isn't to keep people laughing, but to move them emotionally. Use humor when the other adding stakes options aren't immediately applicable to that section of the story. But don't let humor take over. Also remember that stories should be true, but they don't have to be factual. It's okay to change names, condense times, combine characters, and make other tweaks to stories so long as you maintain the underlying integrity. Don't let the facts get in the way of a true story. After all of this, you might still be saying to yourself, I have such an ordinary life, I don't have any interesting stories. That's not true. Matthew Dix can prove it. You can make a little...
India would know, driverless. Ah.
Can you please shut that person down? Thank you. Matthew Dix has a really helpful grid that you can use to figure out where those stories are in your head. At the top of the grid, you put a prompt: first, last, best, and worst. Then you can list a number of different topics you might talk about: your first kiss, your first car, first pet, job, injury, gift, trouble. And look for an intersection on this grid where you can, that sparks a story in you. So I know my first kiss was Ruthie Dehart when I was 9 years old. She put her hands at my neck and flicked me forward and planted a kiss on me that actually is probably also my best kiss there. So whichever of these sparks an idea, you can sit down and write a 6-word story. Just a few words that are going to capture the essence of what you want to say. Then later on, you can expand your 6-word story into a 15-minute story. Ernest Hemingway wrote a 6-word story: for sale, baby shoes, never worn. So trimming down to 6 words ensures that you have the crux of the story clearly in mind. Then you can expand to the time allotted. Thank you for your attention. I'll turn it back over to Maureen.
Thank you, Dennis. That was wonderful and insightful. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.